Hello everyone, so hope everyone had a great new year and I hope that 2024 will be a better year for all of us. However, it seems like the first day of the new year is not going very well for Xianyun mains. There has been some updates and people are not very happy about it. It has really activated the doom posting on Xianyun and even comparing her to Dea. So I wanted to go over what those changes were, how that changes Xianyun's strength and pull value, and whether or not the doom posting is valid or not. Spoiler, it's not. I'll also go over some Gaming changes at the end. So what changed about Xianyun? Well, let's go over some of the buffs that happened. First of all, her A4 was increased, which is the talent that gave plunging damage bonus whenever your characters plunge during your ult. It has increased from 170% of Xianyun's attack to 180% of Xianyun's attack. So you can see previously, I assumed 3000 attack on Xianyun and would give 5100 flat damage increase on a plunge attack. Well, now with the new change, it's 5400, so 300 increased flat damage, which is nice. This plunge attack buff was already considered strong, and just increasing it even more just strengthens her niche. This follows through with the constellation changes. The old C2 was just a buff to the A4 talent, and just in accordance with the buff on the normal A4, they just buffed the C2. And just a slight change with C6, they just simplified how many times you can just spam triple E plunge during the C6 state. Nothing too special, but we can see from this talent change and the C2 that they're really emphasizing the plunge attack gameplay by buffing the plunge attack buff. And this is really exemplified when you consider the other talent change, which is the big change that everyone is talking about. So the new Xianyun A1. The old A1 was when you triple E plunged, Xianyun's plunge attack would have a little bit of grouping at the end of a triple E plunge. It was said to be similar to a Sucrose E. Now, it seemed a little weaker than a Sucrose E just because of the amount of poise damage that it gave wasn't that good. However, it was still a little bit of CC nonetheless. But now, Xianyun's A1 was changed so that there is no grouping whatsoever on any E plunge. Now, whenever any E plunge hits enemies, the party gains a stacking crit rate buff on plunge attacks depending on how many enemies were hit with Xianyun's E plunge. So this means it doesn't have to be like a triple E plunge, it could just be a single E plunge and you'll get crit rate for plunging attacks depending on how many enemies hit. So for example, if you hit 4 enemies with an E plunge, your team gets 10% crit rate for plunging attacks. Now this is definitely the big point of discussion and contention with these changes. People do not like the fact that there's basically no utility CC. Now before I talk about that portion of the change that everyone is talking about, there was a buff on her skill particle generation that I think most people are missing or maybe haven't considered. Her old skill was when you triple E plunge, you gain 5 particles, but if you didn't triple E plunge, if you do the other plunges, the weaker plunges, you only get 3 particles. But now any single E plunge will give you 5 particles. I think this is a huge buff for her energy generation. Some people were considering maybe 200% ER wasn't even enough, but with the ability to just E plunge to get 5 particles, you don't need to triple E plunge to get that full energy. Number 1, her ER requirements won't be as tough, and number 2, you don't have to waste time triple E plunging, because as the new A1 states, and if you want that crit rate on plunging attacks, you don't need to triple E plunge. Now the biggest question that people are asking after these changes is she still a valuable pull? Is she still strong? Because all the comments that I've been reading is just Doomposters. Pretty much, she's useless. I can't believe they removed her CC. She's not that strong anymore. And I wanted to kind of go over this sentiment with just this flowchart that I made of if you should pull Xianyun or not. And I think we can consider this flowchart just pre-change and post-change. So first of all, if you like her design, personality, or just want to experiment and have fun with plunge attack teams, yes, you should pull. I always think you should prioritize just fun and aesthetics over anything meta-wise. But if we ignore that and we go just think about strictly character strength, then what do we have? Well, if you don't have Jean and you don't have Farina or don't care for her teams, then I could say you can maybe consider pulling her, but I wouldn't really recommend her. And this kind of goes with what I said in the original video about just the animal healer role in general pre-Farina, because in general, you could see that no one really used Jean in any teams pre-Farina. There weren't really any teams. You could just use Kazuha instead and use another healer like Kuki and Bennett, and your team would probably have higher DPS. There wasn't really room for an animal healer role. But with Farina's release and you want to play your teams, then I think yes, you should pull if you don't have Jean, because there are a lot of teams with Farina that want an animal healer, and if you don't have Jean because you've been playing more recently or you just haven't gotten you just haven't lost the 50-50 to Jean or haven't gotten in their standard pools, then you should pull for Xianyun if you want to play these teams, because an animal healer is very important in these teams, and Xianyun perfectly fulfills the role of an animal healer. And I think that this branch doesn't change pre or post nerf at all, so this just is the same. But I think the biggest point of contention is, okay, we have Jean, we've lost the 50-50 tour. Should I pull Xianyun? Well, again, if we consider just no Farina, it's kind of the same if you didn't have Jean. I don't think an animal healer is very useful if you don't play Farina teams for the same reasons like I said before. So this doesn't change post change at all. So I think the only thing that really changes are these final two branches. So first things first, you have Jean, you have Farina, you play Farina teams, but none of the Farina teams you play actually utilize plunge attacks very well. For example, Nivulet. Well, pre-change, I would have said you can pull for a slight upgrade, but in my opinion, it was still not worth it. Like, realistically, the only reason why Xianyun would have been a slight upgrade to Jean in some of these situations were, number one, the ability to use TTDS, which could be a buff to teams, and I guess the biggest thing that people wanted to use her for was to grouping from her triple E plunge. But in my opinion, I still didn't think that she was worth the pull over Jean if you don't use teams that can utilize plunge attacks. The fact that you needed to triple E plunge in order to actually get that grouping, and the fact that grouping wasn't even strong in the first place, just made me feel that even with these capabilities, she wasn't really worth the pull. And on top of that, you needed to triple E plunge, so that just wastes field time. Sure, it was a slight upgrade, but just a slight upgrade where Jean could just do perfectly fine and the team will still work well, that doesn't scream, oh, it's worth my primo gems. Maybe this is why I didn't have as much of a visceral reaction, because I felt that even with the CC, she still really wasn't worth the upgrade to me. So without CC, you don't really have to think about this that much. Like, there's less of a reason to consider her a slight upgrade to Jean in Farina teams that don't utilize plunge attacks. So the biggest reason to pull Xianyun if you have Jean is this branch right here. And it's still the same pre-change or post-change, and even more post-change actually. Obviously, if you had Farina teams and played carries that could utilize plunge attacks, she was a team DPS increase, and post-change, those teams will do even more DPS. With the buff to our A4, which buffs plunge attacks, and with the ability to just single E plunge to gain 5 particles, it's just a flat buff across the board. If you play carries like Xiao, like Hu Tao, like Diluc, Wriothesley, or even Gaming, if you play carries like those and you want an upgrade, you will definitely want to pull Xianyun, because those Farina teams will get an upgrade. And this is where I heavily disagree with all the Doomposters and kind of don't understand their takes, because most of the comments I've seen just call her weak, just call her super niche, and just call her just not even worth it. Like, she's not even worth a 5-star limited pull if she's not even better than Jean in most cases. And here's my response to that. So first thing, if you don't have Jean, then she's super valuable, like I said, because a lot of Farina teams want an animal healer, and if you don't have Jean, Xianyun perfectly fulfills that role. So that's the first thing. And the next thing is, I don't think she's weak at all in her niche. Like, the buffs that she gives to plunge attack carries are very similar to the amount of buffs that Kazuo gives in teams. Xianyun does a lot to buff those Farina based plunge attack teams, and because of that, she's by no means weak. Like, she is still strong in her niche. And the last thing I want to address is just like how niche she is. And people are saying, wait, like, she's way too niche, but let's just compare her to Shenhe, which basically has the same buff as Xianyun. Well, if we consider Shenhe, right, Shenhe realistically for years has only buffed Ayaka, maybe Ganyu. I don't even know if Ganyu uses Shenhe, and only now has another unit, Wriothesley, that she buffs. So realistically, she only buffs 3 carries, Ganyu, potentially, Shenhe, and Wriothesley, and people consider her pretty strong in her niche. But if she's niche and still strong, then how can we call Xianyun weak or like extremely too niche? Because number one, how many plunge attack carries have I mentioned? Xiao, Hu Tao, Diluc, Gaming, Wriothesley. That's already 5 characters that can utilize Xianyun, so that's already more than Shenhe. Number 2, like I said, her team DPS increase works the same way as Shenhe and is very similar to Kazuo's buffing capabilities, so she's strong in her niche as well. And number 3, remember, if you don't have Jean, you need an animal healer. I want to emphasize this again. Animal healers are important for Farina teams regardless if you plunge or not. And if you don't have Jean, who are you going to use? Sayu is not going to do the job for you. And because of that, I do not see how like she's way too niche when there's more plunge attack oriented carries and she has that animal healer role. And because of that, I just heavily disagree with all the Doomposting. I just find it kind of funny and ironic that a lot of people like Genshin for its minimal power creep. But let's be honest, when it comes to their favorite or anticipated characters, let's be honest, they want power creep because they want their characters to be strong. And I think the point of disappointment comes from this branch right here, is that people really wanted a Jean replacement, and people saw that source of CC as, yes, this is why I want to pull, this is what I want Xianyun to do, and I want to replace Jean with. So with the removal of that CC, people thought, well, she's useless, right? But like I said before, I really didn't think that old CC was that good in the first place. Like I said, you needed the triple E plunge, and the strength of it wasn't that strong at all. Realistically, if you really wanted Xianyun to just completely replace Jean and wanted that CC, you would need to have, number one, her single E plunge to already have that same CC. Number two, have that CC to actually be stronger. And number three, you might still need the change that we have right now, which is the single E plunge to give 5 particles. Like, if all of those 3 things were changed and were buffed about Xianyun, then I would say, yes, she's a pretty much overall upgrade to Jean, and I might change this to not worth to actually worth. But that's a lot of changes to go through for that to happen. So yeah, I understand the disappointment, but I want to keep it a little bit positive because she's still a strong character. I would say that overall she's balanced and overall an above average pull, because in her niche, which is the plunge attack, she's very strong. But even outside of her niche, like I said, no Jean, she's very important because animal healer. And lastly, just wanted to go over some slight things on HOYOMiX. Just looking back on my original video, there were some slight healing values that were off, maybe some damage adjustments as well. Like, for example, pyro damage bonus, not actually pyro damage bonus, but plunge damage bonus. So some of the values were off, but other than that, there weren't really that many changes. I think the only big change is just my view on HOYOMiX's team building, in which I believe that Xianyun would be probably his best team with possibly a double hydro Farina Yalan with him at the helm. But I think just after looking at some initial calcs, I think I undervalued Kazuha and kind of forgot about him. Like, because he's a pyro unit, you can swirl and have VV, and it's looking like that his highest DPS teams do actually have Kazuha, so you would probably run HOYOMiX, Bennett, Kazuha, and maybe Farina. So he's not as reliant on Xianyun as what I thought he would be. But again, this team might be as high as damage potential, but even though HOYOMiX can heal and consume HP on his own, you still have circle impact, and I would say Xianyun is still a good character with him, and you don't have to worry about circle impact. So that pairing with Xianyun and HOYOMiX is still gonna be good. So yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to cover today. Feel free to discuss in the comments, like and subscribe, yada yada yada, and hope to see you all soon.